All right, get ready, because today we're diving into a book that always gets people talking. Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power.
Yeah, it's a book that tries to explain how power works and how to use it, and
It doesn't hold back either.
no, it doesn't. Greene looks at how power really works in the world, using all sorts of examples from history, emperors, con artists.
That's what I find so interesting about it. You know, you've got people like Julius Caesar Machiavelli right alongside some lesser-known figures.
But just as clever.
Exactly, and it really shows you that these laws that Greene talks about aren't just for one area of life. They apply whether you're running an empire or
even just trying to get ahead at work.
Right. That's where the whole ethical question comes in. Greene presents these laws almost like a scientist, you know?
Observing a natural phenomenon.
Yeah. He's not saying they're good or bad. He's just laying out how they work.
Leaving it up to you, the reader, to decide how you want to use that knowledge.
Exactly. So how is the book actually structured? I know it's divided into these 48 different laws.
Yeah, 48 laws.
But is there like a system to it?
Yeah, so each law gets its own chapter, and Greene follows the same pattern. He starts by explaining the law in a clear, simple way. Okay. Then he goes into historical stories and examples that show how that principle has been used throughout history, often in some pretty surprising...
Shocking ways, even.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics. One law that really stood out to me was Law 6, Court Attention, at all costs. And the story Greene uses is amazing. It's about this guy, Count Victor Lustig.
Oh yeah, Count Lustig.
A con man who somehow sold the Eiffel Tower.
Not once, but twice.
A legend. Incredible.
Count Lustig is like the ultimate con man, and his story really shows what this law is all about. He understood that getting people's attention...
Even if it's bad attention.
Exactly, that's a form of power. He made himself seem mysterious, name-dropping, staying at fancy hotels, creating this image of wealth and influence.
People wanted to be a part of his world.
They were drawn to him.
It's kind of like today with social media.
Oh, yeah.
Building a huge following, it doesn't always have to be about what you're actually doing.
It's about the image you project.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So thinking about your own life, have you ever met someone who was really good at seeming more important than they actually were?
That's a good question. One that Greene's work really makes you think about.
Definitely.
I'm sure we all have. But moving on to another law that I think is really relevant today, especially with how competitive things are.
Okay.
We have Law 7, get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit. Greene uses the example of Thomas Edison, who many people see as a brilliant inventor, but...
But he wasn't always so great about giving credit where credit was due, was he?
Not really. He was good at taking advantage of other people's talents.
Yeah, like Nikola Tesla and the whole EC electrical system.
Exactly. Edison was a marketing genius, a great businessman, but he wasn't afraid to use other people's work to get ahead, and often...
Without giving them the credit they deserve.
Yeah, and that's something to think about. Where's the line between delegating effectively and taking advantage of someone?
Right. Have you ever seen that happen in your own work?
Definitely. It's a tough situation.
It is, and it's a reminder that these laws can have some pretty ethically questionable applications.
Yeah, now speaking of deception, Law 12, use selective honesty and generosity. To disarm your victim gives a really interesting but kind of disturbing perspective.
Okay.
Greene uses the story of another con man, Yellow Kid Weil, to explain this principle. Weil came up with this big plan to make investors believe that he had this...
Amazing deal.
Yeah, a secret deal on a hunting lodge.
Oh, wow.
He even threw in a supposedly rigged boxing match to sweeten the pot. But of course...
The whole thing was fake.
All made up.
Wow.
So Weil's honesty about the lodge and his generosity with the boxing match...
That was all just an act.
Just a way to gain the investors' trust so he could take advantage of them.
It's a classic bait and switch.
It is, and it shows something important about human nature. We tend to trust people who seem honest and generous.
Even if it's all an act.
Even if it's calculated.
It's a good reminder to be aware of how people can use even good qualities.
To manipulate others.
Yeah, let's talk about a law that might seem a bit unsettling at first glance. Law 17. Keep others in suspended terror, cultivate an air of unpredictability.
Oh, yes. This is where Greene really gets into the psychology of power.
Okay.
He uses the example of Stonewall Jackson.
The Confederate general.
Exactly known for his unpredictable military tactics.
Oh, yes, Stonewall Jackson. He was a brilliant military strategist. But how does his approach to war connect to keeping people in a state of uncertainty?
Well, Jackson was a master of psychological warfare. He knew that if he kept his enemies guessing if his movements seemed unpredictable...
You could really mess with their heads.
Exactly. He could create doubt and fear in their ranks. Think about it. If you're facing an opponent who's constantly changing their tactics,
Right.
you can't plan your own strategy.
You're always on the defensive,
Exactly. You're reacting instead of acting.
which puts you at a huge disadvantage.
Now, I wouldn't recommend using Stonewall Jackson's methods in everyday life,
Probably not.
but there are subtle ways to apply this principle. Think about negotiations, for example. If you can keep the other person guessing about what you really want about your bottom line,
It gives you an edge.
a psychological advantage.
So it's about being unpredictable, but in a controlled way.
Exactly, using it strategically to keep the element of surprise.
That's fascinating how these laws can apply in so many different situations.
It is, isn't it?
It is. And speaking of strategy, there's another law I think is especially relevant today with social media and everything.
Which one is that?
Law 36. Disdain things you cannot have. Ignoring them is the best revenge.
Ah, yes, the art of the strategic snub.
Exactly. This law is about understanding that sometimes the best response is no response.
Greene argues that when you give your enemies attention, you're actually giving them power.
It's like they say, don't feed the trolls.
Right, you're just giving them what they want, a reaction.
Exactly. And this doesn't just apply to trolls online, but to any situation where someone is trying to provoke you, get under your skin.
By ignoring them, you're denying them that satisfaction.
You're basically saying you're not even worth my time. It's a power move, for sure, but it takes a lot of self-control.
Doesn't it?
To resist that urge to fight back to defend yourself.
It does. It's about mastering your emotions, not letting your ego take over.
That's really hard sometimes.
It is. It's about knowing that sometimes the best way to win
Is to just walk away.
and focus on something more important.
Which brings us to a law that I think a certain type of personality will really connect with.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Law 40, despise the free lunch. Now, I know that might sound a bit harsh at first,
Yeah, I can see that.
but I think Greene is making a more subtle point than just saying never accept anything for free.
I think so too. He's not saying be stingy or refuse acts of kindness.
Right.
His point is that a lot of times there are hidden obligations attached to things that seem free.
Like strings attached.
Exactly. By accepting a gift or a favor, you might be putting yourself in a position where someone can manipulate you later on.
It's like that saying there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's always a cost, even if you don't see it right away.
Exactly. And that cost could be emotional, psychological, or even financial.
Right. You might feel obligated to return the favor, even if it's not good for you.
You might end up agreeing to things you wouldn't normally just to keep the relationship.
So Greene is saying be careful about accepting free offers and always be aware of what might be expected of you in return,
It's about staying independent.
not letting yourself be indebted to anyone.
Exactly. Now, this next law is one that anyone who's ever felt the pressure of high expectations can relate to Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes.
Oh, well.
Greene argues that it's really tough to follow in the footsteps of someone who's already achieved great things.
It's like the curse of the successor.
Right. You're always being compared to the legend who came before you, and it's almost impossible to live up to that.
Like CEOs who take over from visionary founders or presidents who come after really popular leaders.
It's a tough spot to be in.
They're almost always doomed to disappoint because the expectations are so high.
It's true. So how do you avoid being overshadowed by the great man who came before you?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is. Greene's advice is to create your own path, to be different from your predecessor. Don't try to imitate them or live up to their standards.
Do your own thing.
Exactly. Focus on your own strengths, your own vision, your own way of doing things.
It's about recognizing that you can't copy someone else's success. You have to make your own.
Even if it means going in a completely different direction.
Speaking of forging your own path, I'm curious about Robert Greene himself.
Oh, yeah.
We've been talking about his book, but who is the man behind these laws of power?
That's a great question. Greene is kind of a mystery. He doesn't share a lot about his personal life, but we know that before writing The 48 Laws of Power, he worked as a writer and editor.
For magazines and films?
Yeah, and he's actually said that the idea for the book came from seeing the ruthless power dynamics in Hollywood. He saw how people were willing to do anything to get ahead.
And it got him thinking about the patterns of power.
It makes sense that someone who's seen those kinds of cutthroat tactics would be interested in studying how power works and whether you agree with his approach or not.
There's no denying that his book has been incredibly influential.
It's sold millions of copies. It's become a classic in certain
You
circles.
see it referenced everywhere, from business books to self-help articles.
It's almost like a handbook for people in competitive industries, but it's also created a lot of debate about whether it's ethical.
I think that's a testament to Greene's writing. He's making people confront these uncomfortable truths about how power really works in the world.
And it's not always pretty.
Not always, but it's important to be aware of it. And I think that leads us to the big question: is the 48 Laws of Power a guide to strategy?
Or manipulation.
Or maybe both.
That's what we need to figure out.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be diving into in the rest of our discussion.
It's going to be interesting.
It is, so stay tuned.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like we've been dancing around this question. Is Greene giving us a playbook for ethical strategy, or is it more like a guide to being manipulative?
That's what makes the 48 Laws of Power so interesting, and maybe a little dangerous. It's not a book that tells you exactly what to do or what not to do.
It's more like a reflection.
Exactly. It's like a mirror showing you how power dynamics actually work in the world.
The good and the bad.
All of it. So it's really up to us, the readers, to decide how we want to use these laws.
And that's why it's so important to read this book critically, to think about your own values and ethics.
Definitely. For example, let's look at Law 10, infection. Avoid the unhappy and unlucky. Greene says that negativity and bad luck can be contagious.
So you got to steer clear of those people.
He says being around those kinds of people can drag you down.
It's like that idea of an energy vampire, someone who just sucks the life out of you.
Yeah, I think we've all met someone like that.
Oh, definitely. Have you ever felt totally drained after spending time with someone who's always complaining or focused on the negative?
Oh yeah, all the time.
How do you deal with that?
It's tough, but Greene's point is that you need to protect your own energy and focus. But I think using this law to justify completely cutting people off, isolating those who are struggling, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, I agree. There's a difference between protecting yourself from negativity and using someone's bad luck as an excuse to manipulate them.
Exactly, and that's where the ethical questions come in. Greene's just presenting these laws as observations, not necessarily as things you should do.
So it's not like a rule book.
More like he's saying this is how the game is played, but he's not telling you whether you should play it or how you should play it.
It's like giving someone a set of tools.
They can use those tools to build something great, or they can use them to hurt someone.
It all depends on the person using them.
The responsibility lies with the individual.
That's a really good way to put it. And that's why I think if you're going to read the 48 Laws of Power, you have to be self-aware and have a strong sense of right and wrong.
Absolutely. Don't just blindly follow these laws. Think critically about what they mean and how they fit with your own values.
Because real power isn't about manipulating people or taking advantage of them.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how influence works, making smart decisions, and yeah, sometimes using that knowledge to get what you want. But it's also about remembering that the best kind of power
Comes from being genuine.
having integrity, building real relationships with people.
Absolutely. It's about using power responsibly in your relationships, your career, your community.
Well said, and that's something to keep in mind as we continue exploring. The 48 Laws of Power. Knowledge is power, but it's how you use it that really matters. So we keep coming back to this question: is the 48 Laws of Power a guide to strategy, or is it a guide to manipulation?
I think that's what makes it so compelling and maybe a little unsettling. It doesn't give you easy answers. It's not a book that says, do this, don't do that.
It's more like holding up a mirror.
Exactly. It's showing us how power dynamics really play out in the world.
And sometimes it's not pretty.
No, it's not, but it's important to understand how it works.
So we have to decide for ourselves how we're going to use these laws.
That's the key, and that's why it's so important to read this book with a critical eye, to think about your own values and ethics.
Right, because what might be considered strategic in one situation
It could be manipulative in another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For instance, let's go back to Law 10, infection.
Yeah.
Avoid the unhappy and unlucky.
Okay.
Greene argues that negativity and misfortune can be contagious.
Like a disease.
Right, and being around those kinds of people can drag you down.
It's that whole idea of an energy vampire, someone who just drains you emotionally.
Yeah, we've all met people like that, I think.
Oh, definitely. Have you ever felt completely wiped out after spending time with someone who's always complaining or focusing on the negative?
Oh yeah, totally. It's like they suck all the energy out of the room.
How do you deal with that kind of situation?
It's tough, but Greene's point is that you have to protect your own energy.
You can't let other people's negativity bring you down.
And it's not always easy to distance yourself from those people.
No, it's not. But sometimes it's necessary for your own well-being.
Now, while it's one thing to protect yourself from negativity, it's another thing to use someone's misfortune to manipulate them.
Yeah, that crosses a line, I think.
Definitely. And that's where the ethical considerations come in. Greene's presenting these laws as observations.
Not as rules to live by.
Right. It's like he's saying this is how the game is played.
But he's not telling you if you should play or how you should play.
It's like he's handing you a set of tools.
And you can use those tools to build something beautiful, or you can use them to hurt someone.
Exactly. The choice is ultimately yours.
The responsibility lies with the individual.
And that's why I think it's so important, if you're going to engage with the 48 Laws of Power, to do it with self-awareness and a strong moral compass.
You can't just blindly accept these laws as the truth.
You have to question them, analyze them, and think about how they align with your own values.
Because true power isn't about manipulating or exploiting others.
Right. It's about understanding how influence works, making strategic decisions, and yeah, sometimes using that knowledge to your advantage.
But it's also about recognizing that the most lasting and meaningful power comes from being authentic, having integrity, and building genuine relationships with people.
That's such an important point. It's not just about getting what you want. It's about how you get it.
Exactly. And I think that's a good takeaway from our exploration of the 48 Laws of Power. Knowledge is power, but it's how you use that knowledge that really matters.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the 48 Laws of Power. We'll see you next time.